Welcome back to Behind the Scenes here on nextsportstar.com. Of course, this portion of the program brought to you by Cheetah Power Surge. Energize your taste buds with Cheetah Power Surge. Now, joining me on the line right now is Karl Romain. He is a life development coach, a self-defense expert. He's also an author of The Self-Confidence Factor, A Parent's Guide to Bully Prevention. Karl, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me on your show.
Well, you know, I guess the biggest topic and issue that I want to discuss with you is bullying, and we're seeing it, you know, live in your face right now through the NFL and the Miami Dolphins and the Richie Incognito and Jonathan Martin scandal that's been going on throughout the past few weeks. You know, being a self-defense expert, being an author, and knowing about bullying, does this kind of thing surprise you that it's happening in professional sports?
Actually, it doesn't surprise me at all that it's happening in professional sports. You know, I've worked with some professional athletes. I worked with the New York Giants back in the year 2000. I think what surprises me is the extreme. You know, the fact that Incognito took everything to such an extreme, that surprises me. The words that were used, the text messages that were sent. And there's a lot going on between those two guys that we don't know about. I mean, 1,100 text messages between two guys, that's a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, and a lot of it, you know, from Incognito's point of view is just being, I guess, said that it's, you know, the locker room mentality. And this is just how we talk to each other. And really, we're good friends, you know, and I think maybe, you know, I had no idea that it was bothering him this much, and so many other issues have been bothering him and kind of led up to him leaving the team. Now, when it comes to this whole idea of locker room mentality, you know, what's your idea on this? And, you know, where does this come from? Where does this harshness come from if this is the locker room mentality that a lot of pro sports teams have?
You know, Brett Favre spoke out about this, I guess, during the week, that he was surprised to hear bullying associated with professional football. You're talking about some pretty big men. They're pretty active. They've been involved with sports their whole life. And, you know, behind the scenes, yeah, there's a lot of, you know, joking around and things that go on. Again, I think that Incognito took it to an extreme, and I think when you look at his behavior, the words that were used in particular, it's very hard for somebody to say, you know, that's how my friends and I joke around. You know, there's certain words that naturally would infuriate certain people.
Right.
And you bring in the N-word and you say somebody's a half something, I think that's pretty insulting. That's not something that a friend would say to you.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and in Incognito's defense, what he keeps saying is that, you know what, this is how we talk to each other. And the coaching staff actually, you know, told me that I need to help Martin, you know, basically, you know, man up, I guess you can say, and toughen up. And that was, I guess, of his way of doing so.
Yeah, and I think, you know, the biggest challenge that we have is we have no idea how Martin really feels.
Right.
You know, there's certain things about the story that I feel are just not present. You know, for instance, as an athlete, you know, your first advocate is your agent. Where's the agent in all this? Where were the phone calls to his agent saying, hey, listen, the way things are going here, the culture of this locker room, it doesn't work for me, you know? Where was that conversation? Because I haven't heard any conversation about that. You know, and at what point does Martin stand up to Incognito and say, hey, listen, you know, the things you're saying, the things you're doing, if they are friends, I'm not okay with. You know, that this behavior is unacceptable. Did that ever happen? You know, we don't know that. We are not hearing that part of it. And I'd love to hear Martin's part of it, because all we've heard so far is from Incognito, and we've heard from a couple of teammates, but that's it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and, you know, when you're thinking about Martin's position on the team, he's a youngster, he's a rookie or second-year player, very young on the team. And then, of course, you've got Incognito, the guy who is basically the head of the linemen and, you know, a longtime veteran of the NFL. So just in that context alone, you know, how hard would it be for Martin to actually stand up for himself and, you know, take a stance against, you know, not only maybe Incognito, but maybe some of the other guys who are kind of, you know, in on it as well? It must be a very daunting task for someone like Martin.
You know, I'm sure as a rookie, But also, as a rookie, you also have to stand up for yourself. And we're not talking about a guy who had a bad season, is just trying to kind of hang in there and learn the ropes. We're talking about a guy who last year had a great season. This year he's not doing so well. But is that because of what's going on in the locker room? What's the real story there? Also, as an athlete, your confidence is up, and sometimes your confidence is down. They're not 100% confident all the time. I don't think anyone is. So who knows what's going on in his personal life? And then you have this pressure at work. I think it would drive anybody to the point where they're just like, what, I don't want to do that anymore. But I really think that at some point, no matter how intimidating the situation is, you have to stand up for yourself. And maybe this was his way of doing that. And when you look at the bigger picture behind bullying and behind some of these other incidents, maybe this was the best outcome. Because, he didn't take it out on an innocent victim. He didn't grab a gun and do something, that we've seen happen in the news with other bullying incidents and issues, and he didn't take it out on himself. You have 4,400 deaths of young people every single year from things like this. So, in a way, maybe this was the best way for it to plan out, for it to work out.
Absolutely. Well, and, I mentioned before, a little bit earlier on the show, this situation is obviously very different because it is such a high-profile situation. But in general, how does someone break the cycle of bullying, where there might be the ringleader, in this case it's Incognito, and then you have the couple trailers that are in on it as well, and kind of always the putting down of someone, because as much as you've mentioned how 4,400 kids basically take their own lives or harm themselves a year because of bullying, it happens a lot in adulthood as well. And it could happen, in the office place, it could happen on your rec league sports team, it could happen in so many different instances. But how do they stop the cycle?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. We're looking at, so bullying impacts about 3.2 million children a year, but it impacts 12 million adults a year in the workplace.
Wow.
So the advice that we give people is the first thing you have to do is actually communicate with the person who is the cause of the issue. Is they need to understand and need to know that what they're doing is not acceptable to you. The second thing you need to do is document what's going on and make sure that you write down the names of the witnesses and so on and so forth. And then go through the proper chain of authority, making sure that you report it to the proper people. And if you have to, go as high as HR, and if that doesn't work, then you have to seek legal advice. There is a chain of command or a process that you need to go through in order to handle it correctly. But my number one advice to people, my advice to parents who have kids that are going through this, you need to instill a sense of self-confidence in your children. And that's what my book is really all about, is how do you instill self-confidence in them? How do you help them to stand up to the bully and be effective in believing in themselves? Because at the end of the day, if they don't believe in themselves, if we allow them to have low self-esteem, that's going to have a ripple effect on all of our communities. And that's what we're seeing today.
Yeah, absolutely. And a little bit of your background is, you're in martial arts. And if you don't know much about me, but I've been studying martial arts for about 8 years myself. And, I think part of that, self-confidence definitely does come from martial arts, in knowing that if you absolutely had to, you could defend yourself. And I think that is a very big part of it as well, knowing that, every great martial artist know that, 99.9% of the time you'll never ever have to use the martial art in which you're learning, but having the confidence to know that no matter what, you could stand up for yourself, not only verbally but physically as well, makes such a big difference on someone's life.
Absolutely. It makes a tremendous difference. And I say this all the time, most people are confident when they know what to do. It's when you don't know what to do, when you're in doubt, when you're fearful because you don't understand, well, how do I get through this situation, that you lose your confidence. And again, we see this all the time. We see it in sports. We see it in other areas. You think about a child who's going through a process where he's learning something new. And when he first starts out, he's kind of intimidated or kind of scared about it. But as he learns the game, as he improves his skill, as he gets better at it, we see his confidence naturally come up. So any activity, any sport that you can do, and especially in martial arts, we see that all the time, that's going to boost your confidence automatically. So just going through the process and really thinking about, what is it going to do for me? You know, how's it going to make me feel better? How's it going to help my confidence? And it'll definitely make a big difference, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, you mentioned key people in a lot of those situations that I think might get overlooked. And those are, you know, coaches of either teams or, you know, teachers or crews or sifus or whatever, you know, you end up taking, whether it's a martial art or if you're part of a team sport, of course, you know, you have a coach. You know, how instrumental are coaches or managers of teams and, you know, instilling that confidence, but doing it in a positive manner?
I think extremely, because they actually set the tone and the culture of what goes on.
Yeah.
You know, when I lived with the New York Giants back in the year 2000, they had their challenges. They had things that were going on. But the culture of the team, the way the team worked, the way the team was coming together, they were all about winning. They were all about helping each other improve. They were all about working together. And that culture is what allowed them to become a winning team. They went to the Super Bowl that year. So I think the culture of that organization is determined from the people up top. And I think it starts with the owner, the GM. It goes down to the coaches and how that team is actually run on a day-to-day basis. And then I think it also goes to the players. And let's face it, the teammates have some responsibility in this as well. You know, somebody saw this, somebody knew this was going on, and somebody must have recognized that it's not okay that Martin is having a hard time and said nothing or did nothing. You know, in a lot of cases when we see bullying, that's one of the biggest challenges is these bystanders that just stand by, don't get involved, and don't help out, and don't do anything.
Yeah, absolutely. In your mind, you know, those bystanders, do you see them as, you know, almost or as guilty as, you know, the ringleaders, like guys like Richie Incognito as well?
Absolutely, because basically by not getting involved, they're saying it's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Karl, how could people contact you, get a copy of your book perhaps, and learn a little bit more about you and what you do as a life development coach?
Absolutely. You can go to my personal website, which is Sifu, S-I-F-U, Romain, ROMAIN.com, and you can find my book on there, links to my book. The book is sold through Amazon.com as well, and there's also some great information about my history and some of the people that I've worked with, and I think people will really enjoy that.
Well, Karl, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been an absolute pleasure. You know what? I hope to have you on sometime in the very near future, but hopefully it will be for maybe more of a positive topic.
Yes, thank you. A portion of the proceeds of the book does go to charities as well.
That's fantastic. Karl, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
That's Karl Romain, of course. He's a life development coach, self-defense expert, and he's an author as well. The book is called The Self-Confidence Factor, A Parent's Guide to Bully Prevention.